get started. Like I said, we're going to leave early today, but let's talk a little bit about some of Basil's background, which I've not done enough of with our other writers, even St. Athanasius. And I did find that file I wanted to send to you, so I'll try and send it later on this evening, so you can have it, and if you want to use it to cite if you talk about anything about St. Athanasius. And I'll include a couple of other people who aren't necessarily in the class, but it'll help kind of fill in, round out your understanding of some of these early writers. St. Anthony the Great, for example. Okay, St. Basil. He is one of what are called, did I bring it? Yes, I did. One of what are called the Cappadocian Fathers. Okay. And that's simply because they're from the area called Cappadocia in what is now central Turkey. But there was no Turkey back then, per se. It was Asia Minor. Yeah, it wasn't even really Byzantine. Byzantium was really primarily more the city itself. But the Cappadocian Fathers, there are three of them. Okay, Basil the Great, okay, Archbishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia. Gregory the Theologian, okay, also called Gregory of Nazianzus, but usually called Gregory the Theologian. He's called the Theologian because he was such a profound theologian.
Who was the first one? Did you say?
Basil the Great, the one we're talking about, Basil of Caesarea. Basil the Great, Gregory the Theologian, or Gregory Nazianzus, and then St. Gregory of Nyssa. Gregory of Nyssa and Basil are brothers. Okay, Basil is the older brother. They come from a family of saints. I mean, read the introduction on page 11 and talks about them. Basil's grandmother was named St. Macrina the Elder, and all of her children were Christian and essentially became saints, etc. He had a sister named Macrina. She's called Macrina the Younger, okay, because she is a saint in her own right and she's important, all that kind of stuff, which I don't want to go on about. Basil the Great and Gregory the Theologian, or Gregory Nazianzus, who we'll be reading. Yeah, we do. Later on, his God and Man theological poetry of Nazianzus. They studied together, okay, in Athens. And they studied works of Greek literature. They studied rhetoric. From what we can tell, they both did very well in terms of their studies. Basil, in his writing, your introduction will talk about this. How do I want to put this? Compared to Gregory, he's more plain-spoken and direct, more straightforward. Gregory of Nazianzus, or Gregory the Theologian, uses a lot more rhetorical devices. He relies on the art of rhetoric much, much more in terms of creating and constructing an argument. Okay, I've not read a lot of Gregory the Theologian other than the book God and Man, the theological poetry, and another book called From Glory to Glory, which is about Gregory the Theologian's theological poetry. Those are pretty much the only two things of his I've read. But he's written a lot, as has Basil of Caesarea. Now, the book we are reading, On the Human Condition, he didn't write a book titled On the Human Condition. This is the title given to us by this editor, okay, and it's merely a collection of a couple of his homilies, two of his homilies, I believe, a letter, a homily on God is not the cause of evil, a homily on the words, be attentive to yourself, and then you have the letter to Bishop Amphilochius, who's asked a question, and at the very end, at this, you have what are called the long rules, or, let me rephrase that, selections from the long rules. And we'll talk a bit more about those rules in a moment. Okay? So, After they studied, Gregory went back to Cappadocia, and then he made a tour of essentially the Middle East. Okay, starting in Syria. Turkey is above Syria. Okay, starting in Syria and moving down through Palestine and going into Egypt. And what he was doing was he was essentially visiting monastic communities. Okay, communal monastic communities. He did also visit some solitary hermits, and I need to talk for a minute about monasticism. Okay, where you have what's called eremitic monks. You have, I'm forgetting the other one. Cenobitic monks. And you have, I'm drawing a complete blank on the third one. The eremitic monks are the solitary ones. Hermits. Okay? These are the guys who will literally go off into the desert or go off into tombs, find a tomb, and live there alone, completely separate from everybody else. Okay? Almost all the time in the early history of the church, where you have these eremitic monks, almost all the time they'll go off and they'll live this way, and it might be, for a couple of years, and then they come back, or it might be for some of them 20 years, and then they come back and kind of move closer to society so that other people can benefit from what they've learned. And they don't do that because they're thinking, oh, I've become so humble and so wise, etc. I will share what I know with everybody else. It's because everybody else has heard about them, because individuals have come seeking advice, and they essentially get begged, come back to society so that we can benefit from what you've learned. Or they can live for as long as when couple weeks from now, when you read for April 18th, the life of St. Mary of Egypt, 47 years. She went off and lived on the other side of the Jordan River all by herself in the desert. Okay, Cenobitic are where you have groups of monks. Okay, living together. And when I say groups, I don't mean groups like 100 people. I mean, you might have a large monastery, but within that large monastery, you'll have a handful of monks living together. Kind of like, college apartments, where you might have 4 or 5 people get an apartment together, right? And so everything within that group is communally held. I'm still completely drawing a blank on the third one. There's another one where it is just the huge, large group, everybody living in together, like you see in a lot of monasteries in the Middle Ages. Okay, specifically like in England, where you have this big monastery and you might have 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 monks, okay, living, worshiping together, eating together, all of them, right? Pretty sure this is where you have the smaller group. So what he does is he goes and visits monastic communities, okay, throughout the Middle East and North Africa. He visits monastic communities, and he visits individual monastics, hermits, if you want. The solitary, the eremitic form of monasticism did not appeal to him at all. And there are a bunch of reasons, some of which we'll try to get to. None of them are really addressed in the book we have in front of us. But one of them is, in other early writers discuss this, as do later writers. One of them is simply because Basil believed, people are meant to live in community. That is, humanity is a gregarious group, or man is a gregarious animal, is meant to be living in relation with other individuals for a variety of reasons. One of the most important being, it causes him to come out of himself. That is, if you live with somebody else, you don't always get the way you want. Pure and simple. Okay? So it does become a form or a means of producing humility on the part of the individual who is living with/for somebody else. Okay? In the 360s, I didn't write the exact date down. I've got it written down. He's born right around 330, 329, 330. And I think it was around 365. He was, 365. He was made a priest. Okay. And in 370, he was then made a bishop. So 365, he would have been 35. He would have been 40 or 41. One of the early canons of the church, that is laws, rules of the church, essentially said that you cannot be a bishop until you're 30. Okay. St. Athanasius, if you read the introduction there, St. Athanasius was ordained a bishop before he was 30. So a lot of people had kind of issues with that until they met him. And once they met him, they realized he wasn't young, going to be flighty or anything like that. Okay? So go on and read the rest of the introduction about his background stuff, because I don't want to talk a lot about that. But he dies in, as I said, 379. So he's relatively young. 50? Younger than I am. 49? Depends on when he's born. He's 50 to 51, I guess. Okay? The rest of your introduction goes on to talk about the text. Talks about the image and likeness of God, which is going to be one of the first thing I think it is that we're discussing. And what that means in St. Basil's work.
Was Basil make a distinction between image and likeness? I've read like
Yeah. And then the characters and activities of the human soul, gender and community. The editor, talks quite a bit about that. But I do want to go to page 28, which are the last two pages of the introduction. On the origin of humanity, on that which is according to the image. Okay, so page 28. She's talking about this section titled Protology, the fallen condition, and eschatology. Okay, actually, back to that section on page 27. Like other Christian theologians, Basil sees the human condition as undergoing fundamental transformations at different stages in salvation history. Okay? So she goes on and says, it's noteworthy how many aspects of our present existence he regards as absent in that original. So he sees it not as a state of depredation, but as a state of plenitude filled with the glory of God. Now, when she talks about many aspects of our present existence, she's not talking about human characteristics. She's not talking about human attributes or things like that. She's talking about what we see all around us. Culture, civilization, all right? But she says that Eve lacked those things in the garden, okay? Can't be seen as deprivation. Why? What did they have? Such as? What did Adam do according to the Genesis account in the evening? He walked with God in the cool of the garden. What more could you want? Essentially, okay? So we're going to see St. Basil suggest, she's going to go on and comment on this on the next page. What we're going to see St. Basil, I think it's on the next page, St. Basil suggests kind of why Adam falls. And it's not simply, because he's tricked. Okay? Basil because he has everything he needs. He has everything he wants. And so his moral sense kind of gets, I'll use an example of, Elizabeth running. If Elizabeth were to running now and never run again, what would happen to all those muscles that she's trained for the marathon? They atrophy. And so that's what happens to his conscience, let's say. It atrophies because it doesn't have to work. So she then goes on and says, he, that is Basil, presents Adam and Eve as lacking many things we know as good, greater things. Well, yeah. One wonders. She's not saying that Basil wonders this. This is her way of saying, how many of the blessings we value in this life are actually poor substitutes for a fullness of life in God that can only be experienced now by saints and those like them? That is, they can only be experienced here and now by saints who have a direct experience of God. So what kinds of things, she calls them blessings we value in this life, are actually poor substitutes? She means, we don't have any TVs. I don't think she means these things. But what are the things in life that we really value, is really worthwhile? Friendship? And I'll think about that. How can friendship be a substitute?
Because when you are in direct contact with God, it's like having the best and most supreme friend.
Yeah. Notice, it's not that the things that are substitutes are bad inherently. It's just that they haven't been raised, okay, to this great image. Or let me put it another way. They are images of something so much better. Okay? So love. Love on our level today being a poor substitute for real love. Joy, happiness, okay, all the quote-unquote good things of life. She goes on, talks about how he thinks, in paradise everybody was vegetarian, etc., etc. Now page 28. First paragraph, talking about how in paradise they didn't need covering. Why? Because they didn't really look at themselves. Their gaze was upon God. Basil, however, adds that in time, if they had grown in holiness, God would have adorned them with robes of glory. This is the from glory to glory mentality. Like Irenaeus and the Cappadocian Gregory of Nyssa, okay, and Gregory Nazianzus, he believes that God planned a process of spiritual maturation in a paradise that was interrupted by human disobedience. So, kind of, I'm going to venture out on a limb here because I'm not positive of this, but I think it's true. Kind of contra what St. Ephrem says. Gregory doesn't assume, Adam was awakened right here and boom, the fall occurs. Because Ephrem makes it sound like Adam is made, Eve is made out of his rib, and the very next breath, they're eating of the tree of knowledge. All right? I think Gregory more implies Adam was made, and what happens? It's not like this. He already slowly begins that upward journey and then disobeys. So that what happens? You get that downward movement, okay? He further believes that much of human culture as we know it has arisen, and I love this passage, has arisen as a way of managing the physical weakness and material scarcity that were not present in paradise. Well, what does she mean, much of human culture? Cities. Why would cities not be needed in paradise?
You don't need shelter. You don't need each other as intimately.
You don't need shelter.
You don't need protection.
You don't need protection.
Wars.
You don't need stores to go to.
Just pick the stuff right off.
So all of those productions of human culture would be gone. That's mind-blowing when you really think about it. Because we think of cities as being these great products of the human mind and civilizations, etc. Okay? What Basil is suggesting is that cities, the idea of a city, is a basic result of the fall. Okay? And this program, this theology program I'm in, one of the mentors or professors for it has written all the books for the class, and they're all pretty bad books for the most part. But he has, he's got this one thing that he's on this kick on, which is about, what is the purpose of humanity in the biblical narrative? And it's to walk with God. It's not to sit. It's not to be still. It's to continually walk. In other words, life is a movement. Life's a journey. It's not to build a house and be safe. Because what does that walking mean? Where's your trust placed? It's not in yourself. It's not in your own abilities. It's not in your own powers. It's always in, well, somebody will provide for me tomorrow. I don't know where I'm walking to, but I'm walking. Okay. You'll provide the food for me, etc. This begins with houses to provide shelter and include, because keep in mind, before the fall, they didn't need shelter. Everything was fine. Includes agriculture, because if you no longer know where your food is going to be coming from a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years down the road, what do you start to do? You start to plant crops rather than just it's going to be on the trees or vines that are around you. Okay? Includes agriculture, manufacturing, technology, commerce, and the arts. Even the arts. Basil does not consider these things bad. They're not bad. What are they?
Substitute.
They're substitutes. They're standing in the place of the real thing. Okay? He acknowledges their necessity, but he considers them morally neutral. They're not good or bad. Denies that they possess ultimate or permanent value. See, this is what makes literature professors a little bit uneasy. Because if they don't possess permanent value, what's the value of all these books? Or the Library of Congress? Or the British Library? Or the Louvre? Ultimately, nothing. Ultimately. And C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory sermon he delivered in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford at the height of World War II said, he has this line in there, hold on real quickly. He has this line in there. In fact, I might even have it on this computer. That's the book. And there's the PDF. He has this line in there that, you have never met a mere person. He says, talking about civilizations and everything that we build. I turn next to the idea of glory. Forget, hold on a second. Here it is. He says, it is a serious thing to live in a society. Sorry, I'll start over. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses. He means us. He means where people will ultimately end up. Okay. in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature, which, if you saw it now, you would be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, and I've alluded to this before, all day long we are in some degree helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another. All friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. Politics. Okay? There are no ordinary people. It's a fantastic line. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, novelists, the novels they write, okay? These are mortal. What does that mean? They will die. All right? And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. I just saw Robert, do this. So if he'd gone, would have been a perfect illustration. That's Shakespeare's works right there. Insignificant compared to each one of you. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Okay? He doesn't consider them evil, but he says they belong to the present life. All of our arts, all of our buildings, all of our constructions. That's why J.R.R. Tolkien made the comment about all of Anglo-Saxon literature is ultimately about one theme: the death of man and all his works. Period. Here on this earth, everything ends. Okay? The prospect of God's overwhelming judgment dwarfs their seeming importance when compared with the truly lasting goods. Goods, like material to be traded and bought. But what does she mean as the truly lasting goods? Love for God and neighbor, and practice of virtues and good works. Okay? Love for God and neighbor. Notice she just doesn't, go all super spiritual and say, oh, you got to just totally love God. Because what does Christ say? If you cannot love God whom you've not seen, you cannot say you love God whom you've not seen if you do not love your neighbor who you have seen. So if you don't love your neighbor whom you've seen, how can you say you love God who you haven't seen? Okay? She goes on and talks about the homily explaining that God is not the cause of evil. And in the middle of that paragraph, she says, Basil states that Adam was so filled with the joys of God and the abundant life in the garden that he reached a state of satiety. He was completely full, satisfied. Unlike Mick Jagger, he did get satisfaction, all right? Which what? Led to thoughtlessness. Think of what that term means. Thoughtlessness. No thoughts. He didn't give any thought and inattention, so that the gaze of his mind strayed from God and became focused on material pleasures instead. Why? Because he had the full smorgasbord, and he forgot to look at the provider of the smorgasbord and focused on the smorgasbord itself. And the tree then became what? Just one more tree among all the rest. Something else to be delighted in. For him, next paragraph, Christians are always called to look toward the eschaton, that is the end, the final end, and order their priorities in light of it. He doesn't mean their individual personal eschaton, their death. Okay? He might mean that, but not necessarily. He means the big daddy of all endings, as it were. and organize life in what? Light of that, in preparation for that. He regards the life to come following the resurrection as at the very least a restoration of the original paradisal state. Okay? And Basil and other writers take what make sure I get this right. St. Paul, I believe it is, in Romans, talks about how all creation groans, awaiting the redemption of man. Okay? And what many of the writers suggest is that means literally all creation. So what is all creation? It's not just all creation at the time that he writes that. It's all creation. That is, all things created since the beginning. Which is really mind-blowing if you think about it. Think about all the wonderful little children who've had pet hamsters die. That means, if you take that literally, all those little pet hamsters lined up in heaven, as it were, to reclaim their whatever. I don't know. He asks people to live as if this, that is the original paradisal state, as if this defines their true identity and purpose as human beings. What does that mean? To get back to paradise. He asks people to live in such a way that this notion of re-entering paradise becomes their identity. So if that becomes their identity, what does that then do for how they live? It's not on the exam, but you could, probably find a way to work it in. This means taking to heart in accordance with the values and priorities of the kingdom, as Christ presents them in the gospel. Good master, what must I do to inherit eternal life? The young man asks Christ, and Christ informs him, fulfill what the law and the prophets say. These I have done. What else? Go and see what you have, take up your cross and follow me. Darn, don't like that answer. I'll go somewhere else. Okay? You have that answer, and you have, what's the highest commandment? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Who is my neighbor? Parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay? And I think we'll stop there. And what I want to do then on whatever the day is, Tuesday, is I had individually this up into 3 sections. Well, we've just done half of what I had as the first section. So for Tuesday, I think what I want to do is I want to get through at least, we'll try and get through the homily explaining that God is not the cause of evil. That is the 2 homilies on the origin of humanity and the homily about God is not the cause of good and evil. If we don't get all the way through that, then that's fine. We'll have 3 days for St. Basil. And I am formulating an idea for your papers, since I know some of you are already thinking about that. And is relating to something where you'll get to use St. John Damascene quite a bit. Okay? All right, that's all. Thank you for not having any